and welcome to everyone. I'm Professor Wallace. I'm chairman of the International Institute. And I'm your host. In a moment, I'll turn things over to Yona, who is the master of ceremonies, really, as we know. We're going to speak about the energy crisis. I just listened for an hour to a program about the Ukraine and the incredible impact that energy has had in Ukraine. For example, this attack on the nuclear plant, people think of radiation, but it's pointed out that that plant provides 25% of the energy of Ukraine. Think of the pipelines. The pipeline across Ukraine, it gives Ukraine leverage against Russia. With the Nord Stream 1 and 2, that leverage was diminished. There's so many aspects of everyday events that involve energy. I noticed that Yona mentions the Saudis. I notice where the Saudis are beginning to cozy up to the Russians and vice versa. In any case, we have a lot to discuss. Yona, please.
Thank you very much, Don, for your opening remarks. I think you covered, obviously, some of the issues that we're going to deal with. I would like to welcome also our colleagues and the attendees around the world who are joining us for this virtual forum. As all of us know very well from time of antiquity to modern times, of course, the energy concerns are permanent fixtures of human history, both in terms of threats and opportunities. I always recall King Solomon when he remarked very famously that nothing is new under the sun. He mentioned the sun. Maybe it's a little reference to the solar energy, but at any rate, since that insight, technology has continuously changed the role of energy in world affairs. As you mentioned on the nuclear energy issues. Now, just if I may, a footnote for an academic context, obviously, several energy-focused activities were held by our academic institutions and professional partners over the years. I would like to mention first one publication 40 years ago that was co-sponsored by CSI, the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown University at that time. Charlie Ebinger and I actually organized an event on political terrorism and energy, the threats and responses. And it, as I mentioned, it was published 40 years ago. Another, I think, energy-related concern was organized in the post-9/11 period during the past 20 years or so. I like to mention, for example, an event we had with Jim Woolsey on the energy security and what he called the long war of the 21st century. Third, I'd like to also mention that during the pandemic in the year 2020, we held an event on the economic cost of the energy and the future outlook. At that time, General Wesley Clark and Dr. Dov Zakheim, who is going to open up our discussion, participated at the time. And finally, of course, as Don Wallace mentioned, our focus relates to the Ukrainian impact and developments in the Middle East and so forth. And we were very honored to have a very distinguished panel as well as audience. So let me introduce, if I may, very quickly the participants on the panel, the speakers and the commentators. First, Dr. Dov Zakheim, former Undersecretary of Defense and Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Defense. I will mention a few highlights in a few minutes. Then Brigadier General David Risk, who is a senior fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies and was a former Assistant Deputy Commander the Department of Defense, and so on. Jane Nakano, who is a senior fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And then Ambassador retired Charlie Ray, who is a former U.S. ambassador in Africa and Asia and elsewhere. And then our colleague from Nigeria, Ambassador Zango Abdul, was the country manager of the USIP Nigeria and a former deputy chief of mission, Nigerian embassy in Washington, D.C. And then we have several commentators who are going to participate. One is Ambassador Simonowitz, who will join us, and Professor Robert Turner, who is a former distinguished fellow at the Center for National Security Law at the University of Virginia School of Law, and former Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs, and so on. So this is the team, and what I would like to do is to also welcome the attendees, including our students and interns, as well as distinguished guests from around the world. And we know that some of our colleagues all the way from Brussels and Madrid and Romania, Bucharest, and Jerusalem are planning to make some comments, hopefully, at the end of our discussion. So with that, I would like to invite our distinguished speaker, Dr. Dov Zakheim, who is well known in this community and around the world for his senior posts in the U.S. Government and his distinguished academic work over the years, as well as a contributor to business interests and nonprofit charitable missions in the United States and abroad. So, Dov Zakheim, please.
Well, thank you very much, Yona. And it's certainly good to see some friends here. Bob Turner and I go back many, many years. Charlie Ray and I know each other quite well. And I really appreciate the opportunity to kick this off. This is a distinguished panel, important discussants. And from what you're saying, Yona, we've got some very important people from around the world who are tuning into this. This is a huge subject, and there's no way I'm going to cover everything, which is probably good because that gives a lot for my panelists to talk about and discussants as well. So let me go through a number of points. First of all, the most obvious, it's going to be a very cold winter in Europe. Mr. Putin is certainly threatening to cut off gas supplies. The Europeans are taking him very seriously. Whether he would do it or not is a whole other issue. He's selling gas and oil to the Chinese, but he's doing it at a discount. And right now, his sales to Europe are really financing him as he continues this horrible war that he started. But as was already mentioned, the Saudis and the Russians seem to be working together to limit production, which clearly is against Western interests and American interests. And one would have hoped that when Mr. Biden went to Saudi Arabia and met with the Crown Prince, that he would have gotten some sort of commitment, but he didn't. And the Saudis seem to be more inclined to work with Russia than with us, which raises a whole lot of other issues that are probably beyond the scope of this discussion. Now, one possibility, of course, is that the Europeans will follow the lead of Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister of Britain, and put a cap on energy costs. Now, that's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost the British Exchequer hundreds of billions of pounds. But on the other hand, it's going to make life hopefully livable for the people of Britain. And it may well be that others will do the same. Now, there have been other problems and challenges for some of the Europeans. For instance, they're competing for alternate sources of energy. One example of that competition is President Macron went down to Algeria to patch up a spat that he had with them in the hopes of getting Algerian oil, but the Italians had already beaten them to it, and they had an agreement with Algeria. And so there might well be competition amongst Western European and frankly, Central European countries as to how to get whatever they can get from somewhere other than Russia. Then there's another issue, which is if you anticipate some kind of financial assistance to people who need it in order to be able to somehow buy energy at a reasonable price, and other countries follow what Liz Truss is doing, you're going to get tremendous pressure on defense spending. And already in Germany, we're starting to hear rumors that it's going to be very tough for them to meet that $100 billion commitment to increase defense spending that that Chancellor Scholz had talked about. And he's got another issue, which is his government is full of green ministers. For instance, his vice chancellor, Mr. Habeck, is a green. His foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, is a green. The minister for food, Cesar Andemir, whom I happen to know, is a green. Steffi Lemke, the minister for environment, is a green. The Greens do not like nuclear power, which is one major alternative to having to get fossil fuel. The Germans have postponed closing 3 nuclear plants because they recognize they've got a problem, but there's going to be pressure, constant pressure, to do something about these nuclear plants, which only complicates even more the challenges for these countries that have to find alternate sources of energy. I also want to mention here that the issue of pipelines. We heard earlier about a pipeline across Ukraine, and that gives Ukraine some leverage. Their military is doing quite well, which is giving them even more leverage. They're moving ahead on 3 fronts. But there are issues in the Eastern Mediterranean where you do have gas fields. Greece, Cyprus, and Israel have an agreement in terms of coming up with a new pipeline. The Turks want to have an agreement with the Israelis for a pipeline. The problem, of course, is that the Turks and the Greeks are at each other's throats again. It's gotten really quite bad. And then you've got a further problem, which is the Lebanese-Israeli issue. Amos Hochstein, the American special envoy, is trying to work a deal, but it's not simply a matter of working a deal with the Lebanese government. You've got to make sure that the Hezbollah is not going to oppose it, and that's not at all clear. In fact, Hezbollah, every other day, it seems, keeps threatening to go after the Israeli gas fields, and like Leviathan. And the Israelis have beefed up their navy in order to deal with that. They've acquired a new Corvette called the SAR-6, which I happened to have been on a few months ago. It's a really impressive missile ship. They're acquiring these smaller 65-ton Shaldag boats that can do 40 knots, which is about 45 miles an hour, real fast, which also will help protect the gas fields. But nevertheless, you've got this constant threat of Hezbollah attacking them, which would make the energy situation in Europe probably a lot worse if indeed there were a gas pipeline. And of course, those pipelines have yet to be built. So you've got a problem there. Then there's an alternative, which is fracking. And Liz Truss has started to hint that in spite of Britain's previous commitment not to frack, she says they might go ahead and do it. And they seem to be pushing off a carbon neutral Britain for another 20 odd years or so. There, of course, is pressure for fracking in the United States as well. But whether it's the United States or Britain or continental Europe, again, you've got the problem that the environmentalists are dead set against it. And where you have environmentalists in government, as you have the Greens in the German government, that closes off another option as well. Let me mention two other points and then turn it over to my colleagues. First, the JCPOA. You can't not think about that in the context of a global energy crisis, because the deal, as envisaged by those who really want it, is to essentially to open up Iranian oil and make it available, whereas it's not right now in the West, and the United States doesn't need it, but the Western Europe and Central Europe certainly does. Now, that deal seems to be on hold. That doesn't mean it won't happen, and it might well happen once a new Congress sits down in January, simply because if the Democrats hold the Senate and the Republicans hold the House, take the House rather, then you've got a stalemate. And what presidents tend to do when there's a stalemate is focus on foreign affairs. And at that point, Mr. Biden may well push for a deal that most of his senior advisors were involved in, including himself, when the deal originally happened. Now, there are many downsides to the deal, and that, again, may be beyond the scope of this discussion. But just bear in mind that that, too, has an impact on the availability of oil. And then one other point. China right now is the biggest buyer of Russian petroleum. It's up 17% this summer. And it is, of course, even though its oil is being sold at a discount to China, it's still a source of revenue. And so, again, how that plays out and what that does to help prop up Putin is very, very important. So I think you can see that it's energy plus. It literally ties into so many other issues that are challenging world leaders right now. And of course, Putin and Mr. Xi of China are talking in Samarkand as we speak. Well, we're talking today. It's already night in Samarkand. And so how the gas crisis, the oil crisis plays out will have an impact, and will be impacted by a whole host of other issues. Why don't I stop there?
Okay, thank you very much, Dov, for the overview. You really touched on some of the critical issues. Maybe later on we can get back to some of the points that you raised. Particularly, I would like to check your thinking about the nuclear ambitions of Iran in this context, because obviously we're going to have to deal with that kind of challenge in the coming weeks and months. Now, I would like to move on in the interest of time to invite our colleague, as I mentioned, Brigadier General David Brisk, and is currently Vice President of Strategy and Planning, as well as former Assistant Deputy Commandant, as I mentioned before, Department of Defense. And I would like to mention that he contributed for many years to our academic work. Academically, he graduated from State University of New York, Geneseo, and also received graduate degrees, Master of Strategic Studies, and so on from the Marine Corps War College, as well as the National Security Strategic Studies from the National War College. David?
Yonah, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank you for including me in this very, very robust panel. You've managed to lower the IQ with my participation, so I won't try to disappoint anybody. When there are challenges, there's also opportunities, just like on the battlefield, and you've got to take advantage of those things. I'll mention just a couple thoughts. I think the need to curtail the energy price escalation right now, both U.S. and globally, is paramount, and that was mentioned especially with what Truss is doing in England, or looks to do. We need to look at all opportunities and shape the dialogue, and don't let a singular voice champion any single source of energy. This happens especially as the American people look at it, not necessarily this group, but too often somebody sees a report on TV or reads one article and they think that's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Why aren't we moving out on that? We need to be very cognizant of strategic material competition in building things in the future that look to be very energy efficient, but could really hurt us, especially when we rely on other countries for those material. We need, as was mentioned, we need to balance climate and energy. It's not one or the other. It's going to have to be both, and that pendulum is going to have to swing across the next couple of years, next couple of decades probably. We need to understand the price of investment versus the price of return on several of these initiatives that are out there. Just because it's a good idea, there's hidden costs in everything at this point in time. As was mentioned, we need not to be held hostage by singular countries who happen to have a little bit more robust capability than others. And we need to grasp opportunities when we see them. And I saw this as the Deputy Commanding General for Economics and Governance in Anbar Province in 2006 and 2007. That title came with economics and governance, but what it really meant was it was tribal engagement. And I learned about an area, the largest gas reserve in Iraq, called the Akaz gas and oil field. At the time, if oil was $56 a barrel, the Akaz was valued at over $2 trillion. That's a T, $2 trillion. It was planned to feed the Nabucco pipeline along with reserves from Kirkuk. And that was designed to go through southern Turkey and into Austria. And that was meant really to obviate the reliance on Russian gas. Imagine if that was built and the impacts of today. Just something to consider. Now, I am not downplaying all the complexity of the consortium of nations and events that need to happen to bring something like that to bear, because they are significant. And I'm not downplaying at all the interface between the Shias, the Kurds, and the Kurds in a country like Iraq to bring that off, and that played into it. Akaz, just a number that I saw when I was there, 5.6 trillion cubic feet of gas. I don't know what that means, I got to tell you, but it sure sounds like a lot. At the time, Korean gas was in there, and there was a base on the western side of Anbar Province called Korean Village, and they were set to go. Now, there's other companies that have come to bear lately. Total Energies has put $27 billion worth of projects on the table for that, and and the whole idea now of the Ministry of Oil in Iraq in building up the Akaz within the last year or two is obviously to get out from under the Iranian anchor that they're wed to. Now, that comes with some issues, obviously. Saudi oil company called Delta Oil, they're in the mix now. So it was mentioned some of those alliances that are happening over there. Midland Oil is a state-owned enterprise in Iraq. They're going to get a slice. Halliburton's part of this. They're going to be part of it for drilling. And the Iranians know exactly what's going on, and they've got terrorists trying to stop this at this point in time and do everything they can to turn it off. So the complexities of these things, as was mentioned by the Honorable Mr. Zackheim, they're going to exist across the globe. They're really going to cause havoc. I would argue the big idea right now that the United States might be able to do, and this is thinking big, and I like to dream, but could the United States have some sort of a Marshall Plan relative to a consortium to collaboratively get after energy for those willing to play? This is going to be a global problem. It's going to cross across decades, but it's going to take leadership, it's going to take investment, and it's going to take vision to see the end state versus the initial cost. That concludes my prepared remarks. Yonah, thank you very much. I look forward to listening to everyone else.
Thank you very much, David, for your comments. We'll try to think big, as you mentioned, and hopefully we can develop that consortium that you mentioned. So we'll come back to you. I would like to move on in the interest of time to invite Jane Nakano, as I mentioned before, Senior Fellow on Energy, Security, and Climate Change Program at CSIS. And previously, she was able to testify before Congress on many of these issues dealing with U.S. energy policy, global market, and policy developments, and so on. She also had experience as an official of the U.S. Department of Energy, and she served in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Jane?
Thank you so much for having me today. And actually, the General has kindly provided a perfect segue to the topic that I wanted to share with everyone today, which is sort of the geopolitics of the critical mineral supply chains. Oil has been the key energy source shaping geopolitics for, much of the last century. And I think our view on energy security largely derives from this oil supply crisis of the 1970s. As a result, we've come to associate energy security issues with places like in the Middle East, I think more recently with Russia. But as the energy transition is underway, we're starting to focus on how clean energy technologies and their component minerals affect our energy security and geopolitics. Specifically, like the security of supply chains for clean energy technologies and their component minerals has become a priority for many of the major liberal market democracies, including the United States. And why is that? I think there are roughly three reasons. One, the demand for critical minerals is expected to be exponential. We'll see the exponential growth as more consumers and industry participants want to use them for clean energy technologies. According to the International Energy Agency, which is based in Paris, mineral demand from EV electric vehicles alone could grow 10 times under sort of the what they call stated policy scenario, which is all these policies that are currently out there are implemented. So that's as opposed to much more aspirational, and this is more or less business as usual. Then, second of all, clean energy technology and component mineral supply chains, in my view, has emerged as this area of geo-economic competition, mainly between China and the West, but to some extent also among Western economies, because many economies want to be able to benefit from this clean energy sort of value chains, don't want to become more import dependent in order to deploy more clean energy technologies. China today has about a third of rare earth reserves, 2/3 of the global processing capacity, and they actually supply about 85% of the rare earth today. But they also are extremely competitive in, lithium processing, other minerals, cobalt, for example. Even though much of cobalt supply comes from DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, many of the mines are owned by the Chinese, and they're processed in China or by the Chinese, and then feeding to their more of a higher value product manufacturing today. And third, but then I wanted to also note that I think that China is also starting to become more import dependent for these minerals. So yes, that's because unlike 2-3 decades ago, China is today more of a manufacturer of more higher value added products, such as electric vehicles, but many many high-tech products. As a consequence, the Chinese consumption of these minerals is increasing. So, for example, Chinese consumption of rare earth grew at about 7.5% annually between 2004 and 2014. And they're really starting to be much more dependent on the global supply chains than ever before. In that sense, I guess one could say that we do have this shared interest in seeing the global supply chain to become much more diversified and perhaps seeing more players that can supply these minerals. And then third reason is that China has long recognized that there's economic value associated with rare earth elements and critical minerals. But I think in recent years, it really seems to have come to recognize that it is a geopolitical leverage that it could use against the West. At one of the heights of the trade tensions, Xi Jinping and his chief trade negotiator actually visited a rare earth processing facility in Jiangxi province, which is known for its rare earth wealth. This visit happened, I believe it was May or June of 2019. And that was largely understood to be Xi's message to the United States that they do have leverage, or they have something that we don't have. And that's really important for economic and industrial competitiveness. But I mean, in many ways, interdependence itself is not a bad thing. But I think the heavy dependence that could be exploited geopolitically is a grave problem. I guess, I don't know if luckily is the right term, but, successive U.S. administrations have recognized that, and particularly since China's non-official embargo of rare earth supplies to Japan, the U.S., and the EU back in 2010, successive administrations have tried to address that. We've invested quite a bit in R&D for substitutes, also to reduce requirement for critical minerals. Also, international cooperation has been another key focus. But since the start of the Biden administration, the Defense Production Act authorization has been used to help revitalize some of the upstream critical minerals capacity in the United States. Also, the DOE's Loan Program Office has become quite active, mainly tied to advanced technology vehicle program. But the idea is to try to revitalize, or to, I should say, establish more robust and resilient EV battery supply chains that certainly have not just a clean energy benefit, but also for strategic, DoD-related defense benefit. I guess just skipping quickly, I guess if anyone has questions about the recent legislation and acts, both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which has a lot of money for the research related to critical minerals, but then also the most recently passed Inflation Reduction Act that also has strong support for EV battery chain, supply chain program. But lastly, I just wanted to note that I've heard some folks ask, then why do we, just try to shift away from fossil fuels if clean energy or the energy transition comes with all these challenges, energy security and geopolitical challenges? Is it not in the interest to just, stall that shift? I think there's so many reasons why that's probably that's not the right way to think, but then also right at the moment, clean energy sector is one of them. It's no longer a niche sector. It actually generates a lot of jobs. And so for that reason, it's not something we can really make a huge U-turn at this point. But also, I think there's something to be said about clean energy technology having its sort of energy security related attributes. That is to say that when oil supply is disrupted, prices increase, and immediately it affects consumers. But when it comes to critical minerals, it's already part of the infrastructure. So you do not need to have a continuous supply of minerals in order for your EVs to keep running and also your wind turbines to keep turning or running. So it just comes with a different set of challenges, but then also it comes with its own set of energy security attributes benefits. But of course, last but not least, critical mineral supply chains are just fundamental for this decarbonization. As climate change is a real crisis, and I think addressing critical mineral supply chains just has, I think, multitude of benefits, even though it does come with its own, again, set of geopolitical challenges and energy security concerns. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jane, for the overview. Obviously, we would like you to come back maybe to some of the issues such as U.S.-China nuclear energy cooperation and so on, after the other speakers will have the opportunity to make their presentations. So I would like to invite our next speaker, retired Ambassador Charlie Ray. As I mentioned, he served in Asia, in Africa, for example, in Cambodia, in Zimbabwe, in Vietnam, as a diplomat, and also in China, and I think in some other countries, but also he has a distinguished background as a soldier. He served in the U.S. military for about 20 years, and he served in Vietnam several times, and so on. And also, he was working as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW, Missing Personnel Affairs, in the Pentagon. So, Charlie, we appreciate very much your contribution to our academic work over the years, and we look forward to continue our cooperation. Charlie?
Thanks, Yona, and thank you for including me in this distinguished panel of experts, which I want to say up front, I am not. I am not an energy expert, but I look at the energy crisis from the standpoint of general conditions within countries and relations between and among countries, because as I look at it, it's not just an energy crisis, and I think that's something that policymakers need to really understand as they address it. It's a broad crisis that affects a lot of things outside the energy sector. When energy prices go up or energy supplies go down, you affect the cost and availability of many things. In a developed world, for example, reduction in supplies of fuel means less fertilizer, and that means less food production. So you have an issue of food security in a lot of the poorer countries that has to be dealt with. And those are just sort of the broad brush challenges. Some of the other challenges that have been alluded to, and I agree, but I would say that while we can't make a complete U-turn away from fossil fuels, I would hope that in this current crisis, we wouldn't let it push us too far away from implementing renewable energy sources that will be very critical in coming decades. The other issue too, and I was listening to the recording of a conference of African energy ministers a few days ago, when one of the outcomes of that meeting was that they resolved that their fossil fuels, their petroleum, their gas would be diverted to their own economies rather than to exports. And even though this means that they will not be able to meet their carbon neutral targets that they had previously established, they are looking at developing their economies, giving that priority over preserving the environment. And this is an issue that has to really be looked at very carefully and try and make sure that we don't let our preoccupation with solving the energy crisis make us lose sight of the fact that we still have to protect the environment. It does no good to have all the energy you need if you destroy the environment to the point where people can't live in it anymore. And it's going to really require a global solution. And this is not a problem that any one country or even one small group of countries is going to be able to solve. We need to look at the whole issue of supply chains and how do we construct supply chains that provide the necessary things for our economies to keep growing while the world is interdependent and we won't get away from that, but how do we prevent the situation where we become not interdependent but overly dependent on I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine showed that, is that when you become overly dependent on a single or a narrow set of supply sources, you leave yourself open to some very uncomfortable situations. And with that, I think I will do like the general, and I will retreat into my bunker and let the people who...
Okay, we'll come back to you. Thank you again for your support and service. Now, I would like to invite our overseas speaker, Ambassador Zango Abdu, who is currently with the USIP leading its program in Nigeria, and is speaking from Juba, and his new role as the country manager in Nigeria, and formerly as Deputy Chief of Mission, Nigeria Embassy in Washington, D.C. We're grateful for his contribution to our academic work before, looking forward to regroup on some of the challenges in the future. Ambassador Abdu.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be among this very robust, rich panel of experts. Like Charles mentioned, I'm not an expert, but I'm a keen watcher of global affairs, particularly related to energy crisis. And I would like to thank Professor Yona for this wonderful initiative. Conversation around energy is very imperative. It's really part of the global security challenge. It's like several of the speakers highlighted, it's not a quick fix. It's not the concern of individual nations. It's a global challenge, and I think we need to come together to address it. One key thing that derives from this conversation is that we urgently need a major consensus at the global level on how to deal with this crisis. Very unprecedented, and the way it is moving, the magnitude, the speed, and the coverage is such that it raises a lot of concern. And I'm particularly concerned about three major issues which have been highlighted. Number one, in one way or the other, some speakers have highlighted the food crisis, and I think Charles brought it very clearly. For those in the developing world, this is a major concern. The energy crisis has put a major challenge on the issue of food. We already have a food crisis arising from climate change, from very poor agricultural process, and then lack of education. But the fact that large chunk of agriculture depends on nitrogen and fertilizer, and this important material is not being supplied. 50% of agriculture across the globe is dependent on fertilizer. And if you look at the context of Africa, a large chunk of it is subsistence agriculture. So it has put a lot of strain on that. And there is inherently right now a major food crisis across the continent. And it's putting a lot of strain. The little effort that the UN and individual countries and multilateral organizations have been making will easily be rubbished by this energy crisis. Of course, you know that it took a major effort by the UN to broker some small understanding or agreement between Russia and Ukraine so that supply of wheat and other strategic grains have resumed. And even with the resumption, I think only one shipment has reached the continent. So it really shows clearly that this is one aspect of the energy crisis that is afflicting the continent. The second level has to do with the subsidies. For most part of Africa, including Nigeria, even though we are a leading producer of crude oil, population depend on subsidies because our refining capacity is so virtually ground zero. Despite our crude, we import large chunk of refined petroleum and other related products from Europe. These are no longer coming owing to shortages, and the little that come at a very high cost. And so government now has to subsidize that one. Very recently, the subsidy for petroleum products in Nigeria is almost 50% of the total budget of the country. That's unsustainable. So this is a major issue. But subsidy is very sensitive. Removal of subsidy across countries in Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, Uganda, Kenya was so obvious. Most governments have no option but to remove them, because if they sustain them, they will not be able to undertake any development plan. They will not be able to finance education, health, and the infrastructure. But removal of subsidy had generated widespread unrest, is indeed a threat to democracy. So you find that there is a close relation, and I think Jane highlighted that, between these subsidies and even the democratic, the gains we have made in democracy could easily be rubbish if they are not handled properly. The other thing, and I'm glad, I think the general raised this very important issue about a Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan for the US, but I think it should be Marshall Plan at the global level. Like the last speaker, Charles, highlighted, this is not an issue for one country or group of countries, because we have seen a robust reaction in Europe, spearheaded by Britain and Germany, on alternative to supplies, alternative to trying to pull down or bring down the level of discontent and to make people have a sense of security by bringing in, if you like, a cap and subsidized gas now that winter is coming and the rest. But it's not about one group of country or group of nations or individual nations. The African Development Bank have put a very robust plan, which they call the New Deal on Energy for Africa. Only recently, Nigeria, we also have a wonderful transition plan for energy, renewable energy, and all those. And our vice president was in the US, and he had gotten considerable commitments. And only 2 days ago, Special Envoy on Climate Change was in Abuja. Senator Kerry, John Kerry was here, and trying to see how they can help Nigeria navigate through that transition plan. But that is inadequate. I think we need a more robust global plan to deal with this. It's not a quick fix. It is not about small nations, but the same way. And if we focus attention like the attention being focused on the likely potential nuclear disaster in Ukraine, in the war between Russia and Ukraine, or the Iran nuclear deal, if we can focus in dealing with the energy crisis at the global level with a robust Marshall Plan, I think it will address these issues. These are the challenges, but with challenges come with opportunities like Jen highlighted. The opportunities really lie in coming together, in trying to chart a course that will bring a more prosperous world. When we look at what they call new international economic order, we should look at the new global order in terms of energy security, so that everybody is brought on board at the serious and major, if you like, challenges, crisis. I think this crisis is not really being addressed in the most systematic way it ought to be at the global level. And I think the UN needs to do something, and particularly the leading countries, the United States, and the leading powers in Europe must try to address this. And it shouldn't be left to the geopolitical, if you like, dynamics between China and all those, because if you leave China, many of these countries are building strategic reserves. China is buying up all the oil and energy supplies all over. We don't know what will be their response when they get these things. But basically, it's more to do with their own strategic interests. But at the global level, we need more focus on the global interest, thing that will save this world from a catastrophe. So I think I'll hang on there, and I want to once again thank you for this very important opportunity for me to share my concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdul, for your presentation. Obviously, we'll come back to some of the implications of the energy crisis, because obviously it does touch not only on the food, but poverty in general, refugees and health security and all that. So thank you again for your insights at this time. Now I would like to invite Ambassador Simonovic, who is the Ambassador of Croatia to the United States. And he has a very distinguished background in diplomacy, also serving in Paris and Israel as ambassador and all that. But also he contributed a great deal to journalism, and he served also at the BBC World Service Radio in London, and has a very distinguished academic background as well. And we're very grateful for his contribution over the years for our academic studies. Ambassador Simonovich.
Thank you very much, Professor, dear Yona. Ladies and gentlemen, it's always truly a distinct pleasure and privilege attending these webinars within such a distinct circle of people. So I feel really flattered yet again for being able to take part. Let me just collect a few thoughts, like in a way of summarizing what has been said and what I may add from my part. Looking at the whole scenery provoked by the unprovoked and brutal Russian aggression on Ukraine, it is not unexpected what the consequences, particularly when it comes to the energy, would be of such an event. But I would say that the event itself has not been very much has not been unforeseen, apart from the warnings coming mostly from the immediate Russian NATO neighbors, who were basically having the most of expertise and who were feeling the heat of the Russian bear. There was an overall assumption that that Putin, as a KGB guy, and observing his pattern of a modus operandi, was that he was more accustomed to operating in the shades, not being out in the open, taking bits and pieces, chunks here and there, operating on the margins, doing some kind of searching for the opportunities to insert himself and extend Russian influence. I think the Russian engagement in the Middle East is a case in point, in which he was trying to get the most by filling the vacancy. I'm not sure that he got a lot from that, apart from saving his only a handful of allies in the world, being namely President Assad of Syria, but in the process also keeping the Russian bases in Syria. So the magnitude of the invasion came as a surprise. The strength of the Ukrainian defense, and as we are now witnessing the successes of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, maybe coming as a surprise. And what is where we are now when it comes to the strategic military developments. I would limit myself, because this is not the main topic of our webinar, is that the situation remains highly volatile. We have certainly seen a most brutal, but at the same time incompetent Russian military, but still a military which is very dangerous and capable of major destruction. We also have a nuclear demon hovering over it all. We also see still unseen, but the possible dangerous spillovers of this conflict. So I would conclude this chapter of my intervention, but saying that to all likelihood, the things will be getting worse, if not much worse, before they get any better, before the whole thing stabilizes, namely with the Ukraine able to reassert its sovereignty over its territory, and Russia being defeated in its attempt to a land grab other people's territory. But we are not yet there. So with only thing with any level of certainty, we are able to say that the verdict is still out, and that the situation remains very, very dangerous, and that the Western resolve is now needed more than ever. And fortunately we have been able to see that resolve from the part of the US, from the part of other NATO and European allies, and when it comes to sanctions, part of the major parts of the world, affecting a tremendous toll on the Russian economy. Wish to provide a small kind of strategic tour d'horizon before addressing the issue of energy, which is the topic of the webinar. Certainly, the first effect has been the shock provoked, materialized through the scarcity of supplies. Once Russia has been very much taken out of the supply chain, prices clearly, the collateral of that was the prices going up. That has led to the whole world very much reverting to the fossil fuels, which has not been the case before. We have been having a strong dynamics of divesting from the anything to do with fossil fuels from the major investment companies, fossil fuels producers stocks were not doing great. This is certainly not the case now. They are going sky high. We have seen basically the idea that we should address the climate change as being one of the major global contingencies in an immediate and certainly in a more durable sense. Well, in order to survive the day, we had to revert back to the fossil fuels for at least for foreseeable future, following the dynamics of the conflict we have in Europe. So we have seen a trend of going back to bridge that gap between today and the moment in which renewables would be able to fulfill all our energy needs. And in a sense, also the renewables have not disappeared from the picture, but given the magnitude of the output, which can be immediately put to use by the fossil fuels, we have seen a certain regeneration, certain revival of the use of fossil fuels, and I wouldn't call that a slowdown, but it is basically a slowdown of thinking about the immediate full-blown use of the renewables. I mean, unfortunately, that has been a bit postponed for some time in future. But well, what we have seen in the world is also the process of adjusting to the new circumstances, and that adjustment has been also painful, brutal, and fast. It has not been yet, and certainly it has not yet been completed in a sense of totally rectifying and essentially replacing the Russian fossil output. But we have seen some also encouraging policies and trends which have been enacted to further, keep punishing Russia for what it is doing by putting sanctions on its variety of its products, including the increasingly on its fossil output. We have seen increasing. It has been increasing also before the war, Russia's aggression on Ukraine. We have seen the emphasis on the transitionary vector, which is the LNG, and in that regard, the importance of the U.S. LNG output for everybody, but particularly for Europe. And in that regard, let me remind you that during his few months back visit to Europe, President Biden promised to increase massively the LNG output, specifically meant to replace Russia as a supplier, which is disappearing from the European market. And we have seen a trend of other exporters, such as Norway, becoming the major supplier of gas to Europe. That has also opened up thinking about using more domestic resources in some instances where possible. And the same is applicable for the oil producers. The whole new strategic setting has giving also an opportunity for some countries which have been able to become, like I would say, emerging major exporters or potential exporters. Let me just mention two of them, like Suriname or Guyana, which have found big deposits of both gas and oil. So there is a trend of doing everything what is possible to replace the Russian output. It's not easy, but it's looking into the whole picture. It is very much possible, and certainly that would add an additional level of punishment on Russia for its aggression, meaning that they think that they are irreplaceable, that everybody, particularly Europe, is going to suffer terribly if they will not be exporting their gas to Europe, but instead they would not send, at least for the time being, they are more or less not able to send it anywhere else because of the pipeline infrastructure. So they are rather burning it in the air, not getting money they were supposed to get out of it. So further pushing them economically downwards. So also the other trend is, yes, that has opened up opportunities for the development of some other countries, which may come into the whole equation. Another aspect of another effect is everybody will be saving energy more. That sounds reasonable, and that may also work to stop the global warming. I think that is particularly applicable to Europe. There will be major savings, also institutionally enacted. This is something which is very reasonable. So we will be seeing then again rising output of gas and oil from the non-OPEC members, and I guess also in time with the OPEC members, they are not increasing the output, wishing to keep the prices high. More renewables will be coming into the equation, maybe more gradually, having no such an immediate effect. The name of the game has been, even before the Russian aggression in Europe and in some other parts of the world, the name of the game has been differentiation, not relying upon a single supplier, and particularly not that supplier not being Russia, which proved itself to be unreliable supplier, weaponizing its energy supplies in order to exert a strategic dominance over its customers. So this is certainly not something the customers would like to see. They like to see having a variety of options among them and choosing the what is best for them market-wise, and also the what is for them the safest way in terms of the strategic credibility and validity. And we have seen an emphasis of also in some countries to get it back to the wells and to the other infrastructure domestically, which has not been used given the shift towards renewables. So maybe once this crisis passes, we will be getting back. We will have to double efforts to get back to renewables to fill for what is happening right now. Certainly there will be a revival of reliance on nuclear energy as having a potential for a massive output and unmatchable by anything else. And this is what we are seeing. And overall, the trend is to try to do by all means possible to replace Russia in its output of gas and oil in terms of in practical terms, in order to survive, in order to have enough energy for our industry, for our citizens, but also as a way of ensuring that the Russia cannot have any source of income which would enable it to continue or to escalate the present aggression. Maybe just as an illustration, I may add illustration of the trend, what the countries are doing. I may use an example of my country, Croatia, which has recently, a few years back, put a floating LNG terminal in the northernmost port of Rijeka. servicing not only Croatia, but also the larger Central European group of countries. The initial capacity of I think 2.6 BCMs had been immediately increased following the crisis to 2.9, and just recently the government made a decision to go to double that and to go to the 6 to make coupled with adequate investments into the terminal and into the pipeline infrastructure, downstream infrastructure, to double the capacity to 6.1, which is far above of what we as a country need. So basically, the idea is to establish a hub servicing the larger group of countries in the central and southeastern Europe, maybe going all the way to Ukraine itself, given the possibility of building the pipelines. So we see certainly a major upheaval. We see a huge dislocation. Again, a trend back to fossil fuels. Unfortunately, renewables not being immediately available, but we have to keep in mind that I would say this should not be, hopefully will not be a longer term trend, but then once the situation gets resolved in a satisfactory manner, we will be able to get back to the slowing down and phasing out the consumption of fossil fuels, provoking global warming and the increasing our carbon footprint, and getting back to our emphasis on the renewables. Professor, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I have been enjoying immensely your expert interventions. Hope I have been able to more contribution myself.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Simonovic. Okay, we'll come back to you, obviously, to check on a number of other issues related to this security crisis or consequences of the Ukrainian-Russian confrontations and so on. Let me move on to Professor Robert Turner, retired, I might say, in addition to his positions for many years at the Center for National Security Law with Professor John Norton Moore at the University of Virginia School of Law. He lectured throughout the country for many years. I would like to also mention that he was the first president of the U.S. Institute of Peace in the 1980s. And in addition to that, he served as a soldier in the U.S. Military, also in Vietnam, I think, 2 tours. And in addition to that, obviously, he had the opportunities to contribute to the rule of law in security issues, and we are grateful again for his contributions for many years to our academic work. Bob?
Thank you, Yonah. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. Also, I want to thank Don Wallace, and I think Al Gray is going to join us later, I hope. And of course, it's great to see Dov Zakheim, who I worked with back in 1981, when we were both in the Pentagon. This has been another outstanding panel, Yonah, in the finest tradition of a long series of programs you and your colleagues have put on. You've got an incredibly good sense of timing, and it's always a pleasure to join you. Of the various variables affecting the current crisis, and it's not just an energy crisis, it's also a food crisis because of the critical role that particularly liquid natural gas provides for making modern fertilizers. But one of the variables is the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I'm delighted no one has suggested that we make concessions to Putin, that we give up peace in order to have food and energy. But I want to focus primarily on the benefits of successfully ending Russian aggression against Ukraine, not through concessions, but by defeating Vladimir Putin. As we seek to address this issue, we must not lose sight of the world commitment to maintaining world peace. Article 1 of the UN Charter provides, inter alia, that the purposes of the United Nations are to maintain international peace and security, and to that end to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of peace. We've not done that very well in the current crisis. In 1919, following World War I, the world community came together and set up the League of Nations for the purpose of preventing war through collective security. It failed in no small part because the United States refused to take part, but it also failed because the member states refused to actually carry out their promises. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and Italy invaded Ethiopia 4 years later, the League passed resolutions but did nothing that was really effective. When Neville Chamberlain went to Munich in September of 1939, he returned to London claiming he had secured peace for our time. But in fact, he totally persuaded Hitler that the West lacked the will to resist his aggression. When Hitler made a decision to enter Poland, every one of his admirals and generals advised him to put off the attack because they were not ready to take on the Brits and the French. Hitler looked at them and said, "I saw them at Munich. They are little worms." And he went ahead and committed his aggression. And somewhere between 60 and 90 million people died as a result of World War II. Incentives matter. And if Vladimir Putin is perceived to have benefited from this aggression, a number of things can be predicted. First of all, there's a good chance that Putin will try to rebuild the old Soviet empire, one country at a time. If we're not going to stand up to him on Ukraine, why should we protect any of the other captive nations, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and so forth? China is watching closely and will likely take Taiwan, and if they succeed there, commit other acts of aggression. North Korea and Iran are also watching, and their reaction will depend in part on how well they perceive Putin has done in his aggression. And very importantly, other tyrants and potential tyrants around the world will recognize that if you have nuclear weapons, you can immunize yourself against accountability for international aggression. So much for the goal of non-proliferation. We must do more than we have been to make it very clear that Vladimir Putin has suffered personally tremendously for his armed aggression. There's been a lot of talk about war crimes, and there have been a number of incidents where Russian forces clearly attacked civilian targets and committed war crimes. There have been trials in Ukraine of individual soldiers who committed war crimes, but we need to understand that Putin has not only committed the war crime of attacking civilian targets. At the 1945 London conference that established the rules to govern the Nuremberg tribunals, the Soviet delegate, Judge Nikoshenko, played the lead role in insisting that the very first crime to be identified was, quote, crimes against peace, which was defined as, quote, planning, preparation, initiation, or waging a war of aggression. Mr. Putin is flagrantly guilty of this, and we ought to make it clear that he will be held accountable. Yonah mentioned my colleague, John Norton Moore. Well, John and I, in September of 1990, published what I was later told was the first public call for a war crimes trial for Saddam Hussein. I was chairing the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Law and National Security at the time, and I authored the first resolution ever approved by the American Bar Association calling for an international war crimes tribunal. We then worked with Congress to get them to pass a resolution endorsing this. The world community, in my view, should give Putin an ultimatum. It ought to be approved by every group, by NATO, by the UN General Assembly, any group that will join it, giving Putin an ultimatum. either withdraw immediately from Ukraine, including Crimea, or the sanctions will be enhanced and they will remain in force until Mr. Putin has been surrendered to an international tribunal of an appropriate nature to be tried as a war criminal. Right now, Putin is getting some relief because China and India are happy to buy his gas. We ought to find ways to incentivize both of them that it's not in their interest to oppose world peace. I think that the efforts to go towards renewable sources of energy, to reduce dependency upon fossil fuels and nuclear energy are desirable. I've been driving a Prius since 2005, but right now we have a crisis, and I believe we need to step up all sorts of energy to try to meet the crisis. A lot of people are going to die if we don't deal with this effectively, not only because they're not going to have heat to get through cold winters, but because people are not going to have food to feed their families. So there are a lot of things that we can do. Now, finally, I would say we need to not make the same mistakes that we've made in the past. The Germans have now acknowledged, I think, that it was a mistake to rely upon the Russia for their energy needs. Well, we're moving towards renewable sources like solar power and wind turbines and so forth. Right now, China has almost a monopoly on those technology. By 2025, the International Energy Agency says China will control 95% of the global supply chain for solar power. It dominates the lithium-ion battery sector. It's a key producer of wind turbines. In March of this year, Bloomberg reported that China was reselling U.S. liquid natural gas to Europe at a hefty profit. We need to focus on our dependence, not only on Russia, but also on China. And we need to provide incentives, for example, to India and tell them, if you do not stand with the world community against armed international aggression, we are not going to rely upon you as an alternative source of green energy technology. So I think there are a lot of things we can do. I've learned a great deal from this panel. I've really enjoyed it. But I think as we try to solve our energy problems, we also must keep in mind our commitment to world peace and see if we can't combine the efforts by putting pressure on Putin to end this aggression and then look at the long term for alternative means of energy. Thank you, Yona.
Thank you very much, Bob, for your inspiring statement about the lessons of the role of law in the world peace and security. What I would like to do, again, in the interest of time, to ask our speakers for some comments at this time, and then to develop this discussion dialogue and perhaps invite several of our partners in Europe and elsewhere to make a statement or to ask a question. So can we turn now to Dr. Dov Zakheim?
Well, thank you very much. You've heard a lot of important points from many of the speakers, and I want to address myself to two points. First, after I spoke, you said you wanted me to expand a little bit about the whole Iran JCPOA issue. So let me do that briefly. I am reasonably confident that there won't be a deal immediately. However, the pressure for such a deal continues in part, not so much because of the deal itself, but because of the need for the West to obtain Iranian oil. And that's not going to go away, at least not in the medium term. And so there will continue to be pressure. Right now, the Iranians have put in a condition that evidently none of the negotiating countries can live with, namely that the IAEA drop its investigation of traces of nuclear material that the Iranians basically denied existed. But the pressure will be there. And of course, if there is a deal, it's not just a matter of a nuclear threat to all of Iran's neighbors, but also the fact that it'll open up huge funds for Iran that it will in turn transfer, at least to some extent, to extremists like terrorists like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and so on, and cause all sorts of regional instability. But as I say, the energy crisis is a factor in pushing countries to somehow reach a deal and therefore get hold of Iranian oil. I want to also mention or turn to Bob Turner's very important point, which is, over the longer term, we have to find other sources of energy. But we're not going to come up with clean energy and green energy in the immediate future. Even if you put money into it, that takes time. And in the meantime, as several of the speakers have pointed out, you've got the possibility of people starving around the world, because this is not just an energy crisis, it's a food crisis, people freezing in inhospitable climates. So what are we going to do? Even if you wanted to go back to nuclear power, it takes time to build power plants. The one thing you can do quickly is get your hands on oil and gas, as long as there are suppliers available to provide it. And so I think in the short term, the environmentalists and just need to sit on their hands for a while, because obviously in the interests of the environment, you want to minimize a reliance on fossil fuels, but in the interests of keeping people alive, you're going to need it. And we just have to face that harsh reality. Yes, by all means, invest in renewable fuels, renewable energy, but just recognize that in the interim, and that interim could be a few years, could be more than a few years, we are just going to have to rely on fossil fuels as we have in the past.
Thank you very much, Dov. We'll move on to General David Rist.
Yonah, I have no follow-on comments. I look forward to listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we'll turn to Jane Nakano.
Sure, thank you. Nuclear has come up as another important energy resource, or source of electricity. And you mentioned that you would be interested in some conversation around U.S.-China civilian nuclear relationship. I think it's fast becoming more of a competitive relationship today. Where in the past, there was much more of an interdependence, there was much more of a learning by the Chinese side about our safety practice, of course, the technology side. I think the United States still has quite a bit to contribute to nuclear safety and security and non-proliferation. But as China continues to build nuclear, I think the learning curve has been improving quite a bit. In the last decade, they actually brought online 35 units. That was, I think, roughly 10 units more than the number of units that are Russians built. And Russia was the second largest builder. But in China's case, it's mostly domestic story. Pakistan is the only country that China has thus far exported its technology. But China is looking to emerge as one of the global suppliers, and they do have a very ambitious plan for the domestic side. The target is to increase the fleet size, the civilian power generation fleet, from roughly 50 gigawatts today to about 70 by 2025. If they do achieve that, then I think that would turn China into the second largest civilian nuclear country, surpassing France. I think it'd be a matter of time before China surpasses the United States in that context. But when it comes to export as well, they're really seeking to export to Europe, Middle East, and also Latin America. And by being able to continue to build at home, they have been making great improvements on production cost, also human resource, training, but then retention that we've been having a bit of a challenge in the United States. So we'll see. I mean, I think nuclear does have a great way to contribute to the climate mitigation. Exactly who will have will be part of that. The global nuclear commercial picture is a different issue. So we'll see how it goes for the United States.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jane. Ambassador Charlie Ray.
The only thing that I would add, as I was listening to the other speakers, I mean, I'm a green. I mean, I'm all for let's find renewable, clean sources of energy. But as I listened to people, something struck me. I think someone said, I don't remember who, that the Chinese dominate a lot of the critical components that go into building the devices we need to generate this renewable energy, wind turbines, solar. And it occurs to me that if we're going to really move into these renewable energy sources, we also need to consider how we reshuffle access to the materials needed to manage and maintain these systems, which is going to require a whole of government, whole of nation effort to work. I mean, you can't have the energy department focusing on energy, but the people they don't have contact with the people who control the devices we need in order to have that energy. And so I think we really need to start thinking about how do we pull everyone into the tent and get them to talk about all the different things, including a lot of non-energy related things that we need to do to make this a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Ambassador Abdo.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to add to what Ray said, I think it's a very viable alternative to look at renewable energy, and those countries that are making inroads and greater work on that, China, India. For me, that is one major way of dealing with the challenge of the weaponization of energy. I'm concerned that energy is being used as a tool to hold countries to ransom, like Russia and the other countries are doing. I think we need to move away from that. And the best way to do that is, of course, to provide alternative that is readily available, that is cheap and all those. But that is a major challenge, we must admit. Renewable energy and those alternatives are capital intensive. These are infrastructure that require heavy investment. And that is why I made the point that we need to come together. We need to provide a lot of impetus at the global level to provide these alternatives so that no one country, no one nation or group can use energy, fossil fuel or gas as a weapon to muzzle other countries to do what he wants. So I think that's one area I think we can strike that balance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think at this time, I would like to invite our colleague, Professor Don Wallace, for some of his insights or comments.
Well, thank you, Yuna. I'm not sure I'm going to have any insights. Once again, of course, this is an extremely rich panel. There's so many elements to this. I'd make 3 or 4 points. One, I agree with John, with Bob Turner. We shouldn't forget about the UN Charter, Article 1. We want to preserve world peace. Putin basically brutally challenged that, and that comes first, in my view, believe it or not. Secondly, I agree with Ambassador Abdu. I think food security and provision of just basic essentials for people has to be our global aim. And of course, we believe in world peace because that facilitates that. Now, getting to this subject of energy, first of all, I think we've got to be realistic. 80%, I think, of the world's energy needs are still satisfied by fossil fuels, and that's a problem that would exist quite apart from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think we probably have 2 transitions, a short term and a long term. The short term we've been talking about today, in light of the problems created by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have to think about fracking, and the Croatian ambassador mentioned, LNG, terminals. We've got to take care of the short-term problem of heating and food costs, which Liz Truss, I'm sure, will make it terribly popular in the UK. We'll certainly try to solve. But that's the short term. The long term, I think in the long term, Charlie Ray is right. I think we have to be Greens. Many of my friends are Republicans, and they're still not fully educated as to what's happening in the world's climate. So I think clearly renewables, etc. However, in that connection, I think the liberal intelligentsia has got to get over its phobia about nuclear energy. And this endless confusion. You talk about nuclear and the word, immediately people think of, warfare. That's why I mentioned the plant in the Ukraine. Everyone thinks of it as a risk to soldiers. It's also the source of 25% of the energy needs of Ukraine, whether you like it or not. So I think we probably should have a program on how do we rid the world of its phobia about nuclear energy, which, creates less probably fatalities and accidents than taking a bicycle in downtown New York, And then next, back to the energy side of it. I mean, of course, there are many non-energy problems with respect to security. We're talking about energy today. I think we have to focus on the fact that we have some fairly nasty suppliers we have to deal with. Russia now, gas and oil. China, we've talked about the rare minerals. And of course, there's some really, really sad stories of American companies giving up their access to cobalt in the Congo, Freeport sulfur. Kind of shocking, talking about an all-government effort. I mean, we totally neglect all of those elements. Saudi Arabia is not a very pleasant country to have to depend on, and Iran. So we're dealing with, and this puts tremendous pressure, I suppose, on our president and others to deal with governments which we don't like to deal with, which progressives and human rights types really reprehend, and yet there they are. So, Yona, I think you probably opened up, I don't want to blame you, but I would say, I don't know if it's a Pandora's box or a kettle of fish or what it is. Whatever it is, it's bad, and you've drawn our attention to it. But I think this panel has done it very well, so thank you. Oh, and by the way, I'm very sorry that General Gray is not with us, and I think we should send him our wishes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Certainly, we have to deal with so many interdisciplinary aspects, focusing on the issue of the global energy crisis. Obviously, brings into the picture, Don, the question of security that we're trying to look at in terms of counterterrorism, I think, strategies, because after all, we have seen for many, many decades that the terrorist groups in different countries, even lone wolves sometimes, they target the facilities and the personnel and the operations of the energy systems and infrastructures and so on. So it's not only the role of governments to deal with that, but I think it is the role of the private sector, companies in the energy sector and others. So it would take not only strategies on the governmental level, but and the intergovernmental level like NATO and so on, but also on the non-governmental. And it really means that you have to bring different segments of the society to participate in this particular effort. Now, if I may, we have a few minutes, and maybe we can invite our colleagues. I think some of them are in Spain and Romania and maybe Israel. Are there any of our colleagues that would like to join for 1 second or two?
It seems like we have Mihail Ionescu. I can give him ability to actually use the mic.
Yes.
Mr. Ionescu, please, you can talk now.
From Romania.
I am from Romania, yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. I would think that the panel was exceptionally rich in ideas. And from this, a lot of ideas I would pick up on, which had been put on the table by General Rice. Excuse me if I am not pronouncing correctly your name, because you are talking about a kind, and it was a proposal in my view, that a kind of consortium would be necessary in order to solve that kind of energy issues. Would you have in mind a kind of keeping the parallel, a kind of coalition of the willing in focusing on reaching such a target, or do you have anything else in your mind concerning how to reach that target? Because also the distinguished ambassador from Nigeria also said that there is a very important connection between development, energy, and democracy. Namely, that in Africa, for example, he told us that this kind of subsidies, which is necessary to be provided to the people, it's blocking any plan of development, and so democracy is threatened from that point of view. So what kind of coalition, consortium, do you have in mind in concerning the solution of such kind of crisis? Not now, because now it's very difficult. We are in a great power competition, and when the energy is weaponized and things like that, or others, like in Europe, are thinking to stick on the issue of decarbonization instead of solving the issue. And this solution is also threatening democracy. So, General, please.
Yes, thank you, Michal. Let me dream again. If I was to put together the dream team for this consortium, I'd have President Biden ask the following people to participate. I'd ask him to ask former President Obama to lead it. I'd have him ask former Chancellor Merkel to participate. I'd ask for a representative from the Far East, from Africa, and from the Middle East. Those five. No more than five. And five might be too many. I'd stipulate that President Obama was in charge, because you don't have five people and go for a coalition to water it down and you'll get nowhere. Now, the after effects from what they develop. That's the how, and I can't answer that. And that's a tough thing, because it's going to have to be resourced, and you're going to have to get buy-in. But the reason why I mentioned those first two names in particular is, boy, if you're putting together a basketball team and you get Michael Jordan's name on there, there's some wasta there. And something like this needs wasta. And former President Obama and Chancellor Merkel, they're two big names. Both impress me, but I'd go for a team of 5. And I ask anybody to comment or join the team. Over.
Oh, okay. Anyone?
Well, I think you're right, General. 5 is a good number, but I don't think that looking at the energy situation that you could put a team together, an international team, and ignore South America. I mean, Brazil is I would have 5 players and 1 person on the bench, because I think you have to include Latin America in it.
Yeah, I would jump in and say I agree with Charlie Ray. If you're going to do this thing, you've got to be widespread, and you can't ignore a huge country like Brazil, for example. So I'm totally with him. And while I have the floor for a second, I'm going to have to apologize to everybody. I have to leave at 5 to 4, a few minutes early. So please forgive me for having to go.
So thank you again, Dov, for your contribution, and we'll be in touch. All the best. Okay, anyone else? Ambassador Simonovic?
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I was enjoying very much this debate and the interventions previously. Just a thought, because that was what I was developing as well, together with the most of the speakers. The immediacy of our reverting back to the fossil fuels and the somehow putting the renewables on a back burner, despite the fact that we will be still using it, investing in it, but we will have not be able to use it to its full potential, and it would take time to recreate the dynamics which was existing before this war, in terms of the having a very strong renewables momentum. So this clearly what we are seeing now, it's a momentum of exploiting the fossil fuels. When it comes to gas, well, that is not so, let's say, not so problematic when it comes to the carbon footprint, climate change. Certainly, this is not the case with burning oil and coal. So we are really. I don't have a solution clearly, but some solutions have been proposed. But certainly, we are in a situation we are certainly damned if you do, and we are damned if you don't. We cannot leave people dying from hunger and cold for the sake of something which may never come. But at the same time, we have to have an aware. I think the Ambassador Ray was putting it nicely. I'm also the firm believer in no matter how much I like the sound of V8 and Harley Davidson, I am a firm believer in a necessity to think about future generations, as we all do. We are within what is happening now due to the immediacy of our needs. We may be, as much as I understand the science, we may reach that mythical stage of point of no return, when the climate change will reach a certain percentage point, after which no matter what we do, no matter how we try, the things there will be a kind of almost a nuclear chain reaction. And we are seeing already the very awkward weather patterns. We are seeing the effects of the extreme weather, and it will be getting more and more frequent. And once that percentage, once that point of tipping the scales totally out of our favor will be reached, and if the dynamics will not be stopped, it will be reached, and then it will be simply too late. So we have, at least, it is a catch-22, but at least we have to have an acute understandings of what we are and where we stand and what may happen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Don. Can you make some closing remarks?
I just would repeat what I said before. You brought together a very energetic, informed, dynamic group of people. I like the method that we use because we hear so many angles about so many issues. And I think the value of a program like this is to reflect on what we've said. And Yonah, I know, tries to will publish the proceedings. It's just, and I certainly take the point that was made by Ambassador Simonovic. We don't want to reach the point of no return. Now, I will long since have expired, and we always talk about our children and grandchildren, which I think is a little bit phony. Why just our own children and grandchildren? Let's talk about the future of the human race. So we have an obligation. I think, although I mentioned I'm a Republican, I know Biden is trying, and I thought that last climate legislation will be significant. I think it's very worthwhile to read it because it addresses almost every single issue we've talked about, including rare minerals, including, et cetera and so forth, wind, solar, blah, 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 blah. But I think we just have to keep on pushing like hell. We haven't talked about domestic politics, but one of the great problems in all of our countries is the utter mediocrity of our leaders, by and large, and their inability to really grapple. Take Bob and I are international law professors. Why do you have to be an international law professor to realize that the violation of Article 1 of the UN Charter it knocks out the prop under the world in which we live? No one can talk about that to in the public. No one gives a damn about it. On the other hand, it is interesting that the emotional reaction around the world to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia shows that in some ways that norm has sunk into common understanding. Lady Thatcher knew it when she defended the Falkland Islands. We knew it when we defended Kuwait. But these basics tend to be forgotten, which I think is just, and I can see the reason. This panel reveals it. Our contemporary issues are so complicated, as the ambassador suggested. We have the short-term issues, and we mustn't let them block out the attention to the long-term, the transition to basically non-fossil fuels and coal and oil principally. But I remain an optimist. I think you have to be an optimist. I say to be an optimist, you have to have the power of denial. One could almost call that a form of religious faith, but I think we all have to hold it. Charlie Ray, I know, has it. General Reese is too modest to admit that he has it. I can't speak for the other colleagues here because I don't know them as well. But I see Ambassador Zango Abdu smiling. The truth is most of us have much more goodwill and more common sense than is widely acknowledged. And just the fact that we also have expert knowledge doesn't have to interfere with that. So Charlie, we have to keep our fingers crossed, right? By the way, why do you have those African huts behind you? I know you live in suburban Virginia, but it must be.
Actually, I live in Frederick, Maryland now.
Oh, I'm very sorry. That would explain the huts.
That explains the huts.
Exactly. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you, Yonah.
So thank you again, the speakers, the panelists, participants. We're going to reflect on that. And hopefully we're going to keep the faith and try to involve all segments of society. We sometimes forget about the role of education, the role of the media, the role of religion, etc., etc. So thank you again, and stay safe. All the best.
Yeah.
Well done.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Well done. Bye-bye.